This episode of the Better Every Shift podcast is sponsored by MagnaGrip. Eliminate diesel exhaust fumes from inside the fire station with a MagnaGrip exhaust removal system. Learn more at magnagrip.com.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Better Every Shift podcast. My name is Aaron Zamzo. I'll be your host. I'm a fire officer up in Madison, Wisconsin. And I'm also a writer, contributor here at Fire Rescue One. And when I do write, I sound really, really good and really smart. That's because I have a great editor-in-chief and good friend. I like to call her Commander, Janelle Fosquet, who is also back with us today. How you doing, Janelle?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. It's been a while since I've been on a recording, and so it's great to be back.
You've been working on a lot of projects on Fire Rescue One, and one of the projects that you're working on is has to do with the guest that we have today, Chief Zagaris from. Well, he's got a lot of different roles. His bio is 2 pages long, and I'm calling him a badass of the fire service. He's with us today to talk about, and it's hard to even believe that this is true, but it's the 30-year mark of the Oklahoma City bombing. And will tell us a little bit about that whole experience. And so this special episode is really focusing on that, coming up on that 30 years. And obviously he's going to give a lot of the insights there. But first and foremost, Chief, welcome to the show. And thanks for being here to talk about, a moment in our U.S. history that it's really hard to believe it was 30 years ago, isn't it?
Very hard, but it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for the invite.
You currently serve as the Wildfire Policy and Technology Advisor for Western Fire Chiefs. You're retired as the State Fire and Rescue Chief for the state of California, Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Cal OES, as we like to say. You've held that position for 18 years. How did you describe that position, Chief?
Well, both a blessing and a curse. But serving the California Fire Service and managing their state fire and rescue mutual aid system, fire scope, and a number of other things that we do, I find it very rewarding. And, what a great opportunity it's been to not only interact throughout California and, 1,100 fire agencies, but working nationally and internationally.
I think you mentioned in case of emergency, what do you got to do? You break glass if you need a chief?
I still work for Cal OES as what they call retired annuitant, and I'm kind of like a fire extinguisher in a glass case, and it says in case of emergency, break the glass, let him out. So,
and let the chief out to do some work while we need him. When you've been busy probably lately. I mean, you've been in the fire service for 48 years. You've served under 6 governors and been actively involved in a lot of major catastrophic emergency situations there in California. You also on the board of directors for Firescope, and our good friend Chief Fennessy was just mentioning that. You were obviously involved way back in 30 years ago, providing aid with the Oklahoma City tragedy. And I guess, how did that even come about? And, because you're there in California, you're involved in all these different organizations there. If you don't mind, take us back kind of what was kind of the state of the fire service then, and how did you get involved?
Well, back then I was a much younger guy, I had dark hair and a little thinner. It was a good time, but I was an assistant chief for Cal OES. Not too long after the Loma Prieta earthquake in the Bay Area, work was started by then a couple people in the country, guy that I worked for many years, Mark Gallarducci, Ray Downey, just a number of people that have been involved with the Urban Search and Rescue Program. We're able to get that thing kind of stood up from FEMA. And we actually have 8 of the national urban search and rescue teams in the country in California. Back then, there was only 25 teams, not 28 like there is today.
Mm-hmm. But 8 of which are in California. 8 of the 28 are in California.
Correct.
Okay.
So anyway, we oversee lot of what goes on with those from a state perspective, working with our local agencies, the sponsoring agencies, as well as FEMA and sometimes OFTA. But that's I was involved during that process, and unfortunately, going back to April 19th, 1995, happened to be in San Jose, California, at the California Training Officers Conference that day. We, most like every day, you get up, turn on the TV, and there's live footage there in Oklahoma City, and you can see what had happened with the explosions, smoke, and wow, the next thing is you're on your phones, you're on your cell phones making some quick calls, and didn't take very long. We started receiving some calls from FEMA. Eventually, we would not only mobilize some of our California assets, but FEMA did something they hadn't done before. They actually stood up an incident support team to support the USAR operation. The IST leader was picked, and that gentleman's named Mark Ghilarducci, who was one of our deputy chiefs at the time. We coordinated with our folks and FEMA, and had to get out to Travis Air Force Base there out by Fairfield, California, to catch a military transport. And next thing is we were going wheels up with the Sacramento USAR team on board with us, and flew into Oklahoma City that evening.
So April 19th, you were there. Roughly, do you remember what time? The bomb went off 9:02 a.m. Oklahoma City time. So that must have been, I'm assuming, maybe an hour, 2 hours.
About 2 hours early. 2 hours we were ahead of us.
Ahead of you, yeah. So 7 in the morning, California time.
Yeah. And again,
and you said,
typical in this business, you turn on the TV, hey, what's going on? And
yeah.
Could not believe, the sight in front of us, trying to listen into the commentary and being on the phone and trying to put two and two together. But like I said, it was very interesting. And as we're headed all to Travis Cote 3 to get there to meet everybody, get loaded up and get wheels up. My boss tells me, hey, you're going to be the planning section chief for this operation. And I said, oh, okay. And, I started, making notes and thinking through all the things I'm going to need to be on top of at that time. We no sooner get airborne, get everybody on board, get airborne, and I'm up in the cockpit of the transport there, and we're working fiercely on military comms. And first thing I said, hey, I'm going to need some maps. And so we were making requests from the military to map the area, doing some military grid and getting some coordination going, so we'd actually have some stuff map-wise, intelligence-wise, really take a look at what we've been seeing on TV and being able to work from that. And I would actually tell you that we probably spent, a couple of us, monopolizing that the airtime we had in that aircraft, requesting and thinking where we were going to be. So we were really prepared to handle things on the ground. And, again, it was by the time we, typical military operation, by the time they got all the approval through Transcom and that for us to go wheels up, and by the time we arrived in Oklahoma, it was nightfall, and military provided us some buses. And, as we got close, we started coming closer in the area, there were roadblocks, they would stop, and every time they would stop, I'd get out of the bus and take some pictures. And my buddy would go, hey, what are you doing? I said, look around, look all percussion, the damage percussion. I said, this is a telling story of, what kind of damage we're going to be dealing with here. And like I said, so once we got past the roadblocks, we were on the ground briefly there at the site, and then marched everybody down to the Pac Bell facility, which is probably about a block and a half away, that we were going to utilize at least, to get a couple things done. And so first thing I needed to do was really, put something together for our first incident action plan, utilizing some ICS forms and stuff. I was using an Apple Mac computer at the time, and did a good job getting my forms filled out and things that we knew versus what we didn't know. And then one of the people go, "Hey, did you bring a printer?" And I said, "No." He said, "How are you going to get that printed?" And I started laughing. I said, "I'll get it printed." And so first thing I did is I found a phone line going to a fax machine there in the building, and then I transmitted that by fax. I faxed it to the fax machine, and that's how I was able to get the first incident action plan printed, and then we put it in a copy machine, and away we went. But Phoenix,
I gotta stop you for a second too, because so some of our listeners probably weren't even born when this went off. So this is in 1995. And just to really give a quick, and I should have done this right from the start, but it was a moving truck that was parked in front of the Alfred P. Murray Federal Building in Oklahoma City. It was packed with chemicals and explosives. It exploded at 9:02 a.m. And at that point, there was, we had not seen, like devastation like that. And it was, the building was full. It killed 168 people and injured more than 600. Now, 30 years ago, like when you said you had a camera, what was that camera like?
Well, actually back then it was, a digital camera. And I also had a, regular old camera that you still put film in. So, I jump out and I would actually utilize them both.
But a real, like, could you even see it's like a little square. It's not like what we got now, right? Like no. Yeah, it was pixelated, maybe like 1 megapixel, if that, right? Like, yeah. So you're dealing with technology, and even I'm interested in the conversations you're having on the plane about, right? In today's day and age, all those things you probably would have had on your cell phone or on your iPad before you even boarded. But 30 years ago, you're in air trying to figure a lot of this stuff out. And I'm just trying to emphasize to people, like 30 years ago, the technology is not like it is today. Like, so some of the stuff you're talking about is at that moment was pretty technologically advanced, right?
GIS was actually just coming out, everybody was jumping on board GIS, so we were a government agency back then, just giving an example.
How many people were you responsible for?
At that time, we only had a couple USAR task force. In fact, Phoenix had gotten on the ground before anybody. In fact, what they did, they sent a couple people ahead in a jet and got on the ground. And here we'd seen this thing on TV, but now it's nighttime. We're on the ground looking up, and just the amount of the building had come down in the piles, and across the street the cars that had been burning and still smoking, and another block or two away is a high-rise senior citizen facility that all the windows are blown out of, and just the amount of destruction, from coming in from the outer layer to getting closer in there and seeing more destruction of the buildings and the surrounding areas, and that was pretty amazing, to say the very least. And of course, this is definitely a multi-agency coordination assignment, no matter who you are. And for us on the USAR side of the house, our drill was, we're working for Oklahoma City Fire. That's our boss. In the ICS structure, we're going to be answering to them, and that's what we did. And from Gary Mars, who was the fire chief back then, and his staff, was pretty amazing as things evolved during that time. It really was.
Oh man. Chief, I'm curious, how much time did you have on the scene that night when you first arrived? So it's dark. It's hard to kind of get probably a sense for the scope. of the incident? And then how does that translate into creating the incident action plan? I'm curious about the logistics of it and, kind of how you took that and put it on paper for the plan that night.
Actually, it had to be done fairly quickly to, putting some incident objectives together. And then, because we had to put that IAP together and then hand it out the next day, early that next morning, for assignments to actually hit that pile and go to work. And it was, not the greatest information, but it was enough to get us going. And at the same time, we still had more resources that were inbound to us, to deal with this emergency. Plus, the amount of resources from fire and law, and public works, private organizations, we were going to need some heavy cranes and other things to deal with this. But most people don't really realize it. In today's day, and even back then, we knew that you just couldn't just take a bucket shovel and start just scraping off layers of floor after floor, because there could be void areas, people trapped. Right where that bomb went off, where the truck was parked, the Ryder truck that he'd rented, was right in front of a nursery, kids' nursery. And that was really, and you just have to imagine this huge crater that's on the ground there, and there's debris that come down from when the building had, gone up and dropped down. And, we had FBI agents and all kind, a lot of federal ABC agencies were in that building besides regular government employees in the mural building there. And that was a different time, and for a guy like me who done some things, but I've, maybe I've seen some horrendous accidents and things. Never ever in my life had seen anything similar to this,
Well, when you got there in the morning and you could see it in daylight, what were your first thoughts?
I'm like, overwhelmed in a lot of cases, what we were going to do and exactly how we were going to do it. And, but one of the early things is that we didn't want to continue to be down the street, block and a half down there at the Pac Bell building that we were actually in. So what we ended up doing was the far end of the building was where they received deliveries, and the mailroom was there at the mural building, at the federal building. And so you'd almost shake your head a little bit, because we decided that we were going to put the IST inside that little area. And we actually did. So we had some power, and we went to doing some things. And over several days, we actually remodeled. We took out walls to make it bigger for the briefing as more and more people showed up each and every day.
And there wasn't a collapse
So it was,
concern?
I was going to say, yeah, structurally, not a concern at that time.
That wasn't a concern of ours at the time. Assigned to the USAR teams are structural engineers that are, very good at their job. And they said, no, we were good. And otherwise we wouldn't have gone in there. But it really worked out good, because, cut the amount of time going back and forth and getting up on the building, doing the things we needed to do. So it worked out extremely well. The other thing we did was, we had to get the USAR teams on rotations and, maximize as many people as we hopefully could. When you actually look at the mural building, you'll see early on that there's this, a big slab that was still hanging down, that hadn't come down yet. And over time, that became a big issue. We had structural engineers with putting beams on there to make sure that we, the integrity of the building and things were happening. During the time we were on the ground, we had to deal with rain, tornadoes in the area. Learned a lot dealing with Oklahoma City and what they have to deal with on a normal day that we generally don't deal with in California as much. But that was, if you're Oklahoma City, this is your incident. And, we had to be very careful. We weren't perceived as trying to push them out, or that we were the experts from Dover coming in. We literally, worked with them. And one other folks, Mike Shanahan, ran their special operations. He had this red sweatshirt on, and that guy, well, I'll tell you, from the first body that needed to be recovered, they didn't want us pulling it out. They wanted to pull their people out. I mean, it was very tough time. As one of the things that happened not too far again from the facility there, from the building, was they had a convention center was going on at the time for the restaurant associations for Oklahoma. And typical Oklahomans, those folks went to feeding us, taking care of us, calling in anybody they needed to get the supplies in. We started running the USAR folks, had their equipment go in there. That's where they'd spend. They had showers, and a lot of our logistics were easily coordinated out of there. Although they're on site, like any other good incident, we had to bring in porta potties and other things. Most people, we went through a lot of equipment just on the USAR side and everything else with rain and everything. We had to order Nomex. We actually ordered from General Services off one of their contracts that supplies the military. We had a truck and trailer load full of boots because our folks were tearing up their boots so quickly, and the rubble and everything else there. I mean, it was a very interesting time. In fact, I often laughed. You probably heard a gentleman by the name of Tommy Carr, who came out of Maryland, went down to Charlotte, later died. But Tommy was our logistics section chief at the time, and Tommy, he was just great to work with, and just made a lot of things logistically happen, and and for a lot of us, some of us have been in national USAR meetings about all this coming together. None of us really had worked on the ground together the way we did, and it was really pretty amazing, and something I would tell you probably once in a lifetime. And who knew then that we would lose, like Ray Downey during 9/11, and what a legend he was, and his kids have picked up after him, and I mean, just some really good things. And there's a gentleman by the name of Harold Schoppenholmer, who's came out of Menlo Park, and boy, talked about a mover and a shaker back in his day. Harold would later go on become the chief of Menlo Park. End up having a career. Most people would have been a career-ending accident at home, paralyzed, and the waist down, and he was off for a little while, but ended up coming back still as the fire chief, and he still got probably. Like the old army, we do more by 16.
Yeah.
Harold, I mean, just the amount of energy. I still talk to people like Harold and some of them, and we've lost so many of our folks from back then that helped really build our program today. I don't know that today's USAR folks that are involved really know what it took to bring people together and have the system that they have today. Been a lot of trials and tribulations.
Yes. Well, the communications back then were just not as easy. And even, you had mentioned everybody was probably around that TV right when you first heard it, not on their phones, not getting, hey, here's live footage. That's, I think, one of the biggest differences, right? Between 30 years ago, you could have went on your phone, you could have seen it on TV. You might have had 5 or 6 different angles, had 4 or 5 different reports going on. People would have been on different things, but back then everybody's huddled around that TV. And as soon as you kind of went into, hey, you guys are going, did you flip a switch and look at that and go, okay, now I'm going back to incident management, right? Like, were you able to do it just like that? Or were there times where you just like, I'm in over my head, but I got to figure something out, right?
Well, there's plenty of times you felt like you're in over your head, but I would tell you this. So my boss, we're talking, he says, hey, you're going with us. I said, hey, I've got a presentation to do today. I've got a commitment. I'll come afterwards. And so he says, okay. And so anyway, one of the folks that was going with us needed some equipment, so I gave him some equipment out of my vehicle I had at the time, and then my boss, calls back and says, "You're going. Don't worry about your presentation. This is an operational issue." I said, "Okay," and but I felt several times, and unlike the ISTs they have today, or an incident management teams where you spend years working together with different people, all of us were thrown together. I had what we call the field operations guide out of California, and I'd be given people to work with us in different things, and hey, what do you know about this position? I don't know. And so I go over to the copy machine and I put that field operations guide down. I make a copy and highlight a couple things. They said, "Here you go," and and we'd mentor them along the way, and it all worked out, immensely, like you wouldn't believe. In fact, I ended up with somebody out of Miami-Dade. One of the gals there had an issue and an injury, and so they said, "Hey, can she work in here?" I said, "Sure." At the time, I thought I was just getting firefighter off from the team, and wasn't until 2 days later I found out she was actually an assistant chief with Miami-Dade. But Cindy Bashir's, she was good, and I mean, I at one point I said, "Wow." I said, "What do you do there at Miami-Dade?" And she told me. I said, "Shit." I said, "I wish I'd known that up front. Would have made a lot of use. I shouldn't have assumed to start with." But a lot of people just came together. One of my deputy plan section chief was a U.S. Forest Service guy off the Tabe National Forest there in Las Vegas, who later went on to work for FEMA USAR program as a full-time employee there. But just a lot of different things working back and forth. The coordination, both at the local, state. At one point, very early into the incident, the FBI wanted us out of there. They were in hot pursuit of getting the evidence and what they needed to do, and so they didn't want anybody around where the explosion had occurred. The crater was in the ground, and so that presented a big fight between USAR and the FBI. In fact, James Lee Witt, who's the FEMA director at the time, and Louis Freeze, who's the FBI director, flew out to meet with a couple of us and have a conversation about our problems and making things work. And I remember the FBI guy that was in charge on the ground started off just ripping into my boss, who's the IST leader, Mark Gallarducci, and my boss just sat there very quietly. And when then he finishes, he says, "You done?" And then my boss lit it up, and I was like, I'm leaning against the wall, and I'm like going, "God, could I recess into this wall and be gone?" It was pretty intense. And when we were done having our say, what ends up happening is that the two bosses, Louis Freeze and James Lee Witt, have a conversation and call the guy for the FBI and Mark Gallarducci in a room, and they tell him how things are going to be. And very next day, we ended up with a gentleman from the FBI out of North Carolina, named Bud Evans, and he was like stuck to us like glue from then on. We had no more issues. In fact, what we ended up doing was we built a cover over that crater. It was almost like we built a deck, so no debris, nothing else could get in there. And the drill was, until we were done with what we needed to, that part of the investigation was going to have to be put on hold. But I'm going to share this with you. So we'd be working with the FBI. They went out and got an exact rider truck, that they had used, and they put barrels in there. They real quickly, put together a lot of stuff, and very rigorously working at it. As each day went on, security got tighter and tighter at that incident. people had to have credentials to get in, and it was pretty amazing, to say the very least. And the more of that building we pulled back and cleared out, the more complicated it became for our structural engineers, our rescue people, and everything else. We worked with law enforcement, put together a list of people that were in the building, or people who knew were in the building by because other people gotten out, but they tell us who's in there. So there's a list, a very confidential list of where things were. And so each floor of the Muir building actually had a different carpeting on the floor. So we actually were able to tell by that large building where, how it fell,
where the different floors were, right? And
oh yeah,
did that help with I guess a question too is, was it rescue at first at any moment, or was it always recovery? Or, when you look at that incident plan, what was really the first kind of priority?
We went with, it had to be rescue up front. We didn't know. In fact, Mark Gallarducci, working with Ray Downey and them, actually put together a document for Oklahoma City and ultimately the governor when they finally made the decision to go from rescue to recovery mode, as an example. And it was based upon, like Lone Prieta and Buck Helms, who had been on the Cypress structure, and how long he'd lasted, although, he didn't survive after they got him out. But, it was pretty historical what needed to be done, how it needed to be done. And like I said, it was pretty intense. One of the Oklahoma City chiefs, I don't remember his name now, his wife worked for one of the local stations, and not only he was good, but she was good. And, just a lot of things went back and forth there. It's kind of interesting too, because, a lot of people felt, oh, the USAR is here, we're going to save the day. And, and over the vast time that we've had USAR, we really haven't had that many active saves in the program per se. It's been more body recovery, but the hardest body recovery we actually when we kept digging into that building was to get to the daycare center. Yeah. And there was still, that was really one of the harder parts. A couple of days into the incident, we would walk over to one of the churches and meet with law enforcement and give the families an update in that. And we were very careful never to mention anybody's name. Very few people had the list. And so if you said, hey, number 15, and we'd know who that was. But like I said, every one of those recoveries was very personal for Oklahoma City Fire, who wanted to make sure, and not only for them, but federal law enforcement who had, federal officers who were killed in that building as well. That type of recovery, at some point, we had to work with ATF and DEA and a host of federal agencies who had evidence in that building that needed to be extracted as well for ongoing cases, with the Justice Department and stuff. So, complicated at the highest levels. We had a presidential visit, and we had quite a conversation about the presidential visit. And as much as it was great to have the president there, we did not want the president on site, because the president on site, that means we're going to stop all operations. And so what we agreed to was we would put together a briefing packet for the president and the vice president and them. And that's actually what we did. We blew up some pictures that were very large. So the offsite briefing area, that was done, and made everything come together in that form and fashion. And, it's actually only interesting down the road, but at some point somebody said, well, how much that cost? How much that briefing cost you? And I said, well, I don't know, I think about $5,000 is what we spent to blow everything up. $5,000. I said,
Yeah, that's nothing in this day and age. It was President Clinton, correct? Still at that point.
Yeah, it wasn't anything back then either. But in the pictures we showed them, from everything from 8x10s to blow-ups, were some pretty gruesome things. In fact, the first lady was in tears, and it was, just, you can imagine the building, you're in it, blows up, and then it comes down, and it dismembers and crushes, and just body fluids, and so very difficult time.
Yep.
Dogs were big time then. The search cameras, acoustic sound devices, all things that we, were state of the art then. You go, other than the dogs, you go, wow, it's a pretty antiquated equipment back then. In fact, a lot of the cameras and stuff, I think we're in the process of the search cams that, a retired firefighter out of Kern had put together. We were converting, those were coming out as color now, and then we had, a mic, with the lens there that, could do things. And so we've really evolved, and, the type of tools we had that were, in development, what we're using today, cutters and plasma cutters.
Yeah.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Protect yourself with MagnaGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes in a snap. Visit magnagrip.com to download MagnaGrip's free grant guide with expert tips to solidify a grant for essential safety equipment, such as MagnaGrip's exhaust removal systems. That's magnagrip.com to download the free guide.
Even communication, I'm amazed at, you talked, and you still know everyone's names and what they did, and as it sounds like there's a lot of people that were just thrown into these positions, as you were saying, hey, this is what you're going to do. What was most of the communication? Just, hey, I need to talk to so and so. You run over to where they were. It was all face to face. Some phones, right? But cell phones probably weren't that prevalent, or at all. Not very prevalent, right?
No, cell phones were prevalent back then. We actually, and all the USAR teams all had radio communications. That stuff some of the interoperability been worked on. We even had, if you look at the satellite phones we were using then versus what we use today, you'd shake your head. But actually that side went well. The fact that we were on a very tight site itself, not spread out like, on a major earthquake or something like that, or flooding or hurricane situation. So, it worked itself out, really good. Unlike if we were in a natural disaster where we'd take out a lot of our towers and maybe even our fiber optics and our power, we had all those things there. So, I mean, that was the nice thing about that setup. But, we had, folks on a rotation basis coming in, going out. I think we used 11 of the urban search and rescues of the 25 in the country. And of course, if you weren't one of the folks that got to go, like, oh my God, what, pass us by. And it was early on in the USAR program. So being deployed was actually not only a big morale issue, but financially to do some things for your cash and do some other things was also, very beneficial as well for the overall system, trying to make things come together. I mean, we had probably just under 1,000 people on site there, at least from the fire side, plus law enforcement and, think local, state, federal, and if there was a federal agency who wasn't in that building, they were probably there anyway, but just tremendous amount of coordination that took place. A lot of heartache and sorrow. I can actually tell you that when I came back, I was mandatory to, go through debriefing, and it took me months, to get back into normal routine after being out on the ground for 16 days and everything else. But I think the national system learned a lot. It was, and we continue to learn to this day, the changes and how lucky, we've become. And, back in those days, we had a little bit of a hazmat. We didn't do WMD the way we do today. There wasn't a swift water component to the teams. Back, California was probably the only ones that had a swift water component. We didn't have that until the fall of '95 when we had floods in California. And we spent $500,000 and bought all of our USAR teams swift water capability and all the equipment, who would end up being used during Hurricane Katrina, because the federal system didn't have it. So a guy by the name of Bill Lokey, who was federal coordinating officer at the time, who had come out of the Puget Sound USAR team, knew we had the capability because he had actually worked for us at Cal OES at one time. And he calls and says, "Hey, can you guys bring your swift water equipment?" And I said, "I'd be more than happy to, as long as you guys cover any damage or loss. I've got no problem." So we cut a deal, and our crews went out the door with all their swift water equipment and stuff. And we flew it all out of Travis Air Force Base again.
What lessons did you learn, not only you personally, but, you, like you mentioned USAR and the organizations involved? What do you think, highlight, if you would, a couple of the lessons that you guys talk about that transferred to, other incidents?
Well, probably one of the better things that I said, again, up until then, they really didn't have an IST developed. We developed one on the fly, and now it's part of everyday component, that has really blossomed itself. The early days of USAR, we actually used a lot of things that came out of our fire scope program, how we developed committees and did things, and that actually got put into how some of the national program grew and was developed. We're a couple days into the incident, and all the plans I have for the building are all, like the architect plans and that, and they're not, they're okay, but they're not what I need to. So, I tell my boss, I said, "Hey, I want to bring our GIS guys out from California." He says, "What?" He says, "It's not a wildland fire, Zagaris." And I said, "Trust me, I need them." And he says, "Okay, I got to go to FEMA." So anyway, we had them on a plane and got them out, and they brought their computers. They didn't have any plotters. And I said, "Here's the good news." I said, "What's that?" And I said, "I'm going to walk you over to the Pac Bell building over here." And I said, "I saw they had some plotters in there, so I know they must have GIS." So we actually tied them into their GIS people who helped our folks, really put together some things. So, I told you we had taken the mail room there at the Mirror building, and we used it for briefing. So imagine now we've got 9 floors. And so now the roll of paper, I don't know if it was 36 or 48, but maybe 36 back then, but I think it's 48. So anyway, they go to putting the entire each floor out there, and so shows you the building, who's there, the rooms, shows you now, we've got it marked in there how the building is, been blown up and what part of that's on the ground. And you just have to imagine, how we went from doing one thing to another. And I look at today's day and how they search for people, how they get almost real-time data, utilizing, our cellular capability and technology that's out there. I always tell people, I say, "Boy, I sure wish I had FirstNet back then."
Right. Right. One of the reasons why we need to embrace FirstNet too, right? Because it's really useful, especially in those situations. So.
Well, it's only useful, but it's really, if you think about it, it's really the only, AT&T built it for FirstNet Authority, which is part of the Department of Commerce, because we asked for it after 9/11. And it's the only cellular capability that is actually codified into law. Unlike any of the other carriers, this is codified into law for us. It's got an advisory group made up of fire, law, public works, some other elected officials that are in there. But and we're getting ready to have to go out to get it reauthorized, but just April 1st, we got 7 million people have got a phone on the system, and over 30,000 agencies. Again, providing interoperability where we didn't have it before, providing robust capabilities and doing things that, we had some good things back then, but not the way we do today. And I mean, to have an event like this, that's domestic terrorism, who would believe we'd have one of our own people, kill 167 people, injured 684 people, destroyed that building that eventually had to be demolished. But it was quite an event. It's every day, by the minute, by the hour was a challenge to meet both politically and operationally. While we had some people injured off USAR, nobody real seriously, but we had a legislator, Chris Hastings, got involved, and he wanted to thank all the USAR folks before they left. And so I had to work with him, and what he did was he worked with the Cowboy Hall of Fame there that was in town.
Oklahoma State Cowboys, right? You're talking about
Yep. He got people to donate. And so before the teams would leave, they would hold a great big get together and thank them and feed them. And it was quite an elaborate deal. And I said, I told him, I think after the second one we did, I said, you got to make me a promise. He says, what's that? And I said, Assemblyman, I said, nice that you thank us. People you really need to thank are your folks who were there and are still there. And I said, and he says, really? And I said, they're the real heroes. We came in here after the fact. I said, those are the real heroes. And I was actually lucky enough to have him, do that. In fact, he requested that I come out for that event after a few weeks after the bombing was over. And the people I work for said, no, we're not sending you back for that. And I said, okay. So I tell the representative, he gets on the phone to the governor, and the governor, they send a letter to our governor at the time. And next thing is I get called in. I said, well, I guess you're going to Oklahoma. That's what we want. But, I actually got to be there to see them thank their people. In fact, the representative put me at the table with him and his wife and their kids. And he was out of Tulsa, where he was out of,
that's a full circle kind of example, though, just to how stuff got done. Right? Anybody on scene called someone who knew somebody you needed that resource there on scene. You got them there through a friend. That's like the essence of the fire service, right? So hopefully people listening going, that's the stuff we're good at. That's what we do. And it's what you guys had to do every hour, every single day during that.
But you come up with an idea or a thought, and then you share it amongst a group of people that were there, but plus our Oklahoma compadres there that we're working for. And like Mike Shannon, he went on to do a lot of training afterwards, worked with one of the companies that had a lot of the rigging equipment and stuff. A lot of tremendous things. One of the guys there from Southwest Pac Bell was in GIS, went on to do a lot of things with GIS for the federal government for looking at buildings with GIS and how to do better security and a lot of the different things there. So, and my hat's off to them, because they all filled a niche, plugged a hole. And I don't care where you're at or where you're from, but relationships are everything in this business. And it's who you know, what you know, and it's really important. In wildland firefighting, one of the things I tell a lot of folks, I said, if you got somebody that's still around that's now retired, but maybe fire had a big fire in that area before, they're the people you really want to talk to. How the fire acted back then. They cut roads in now that have been overgrown, and if they are, maybe we can go back and reopen them. You get some people with some local knowledge. You find the ranchers, the farmers, and when you get out there with public works, I can't tell you, after being on the ground there during the LA fires here in January, all the people, the hydrants, we didn't have enough water, listen to the non-public safety folks that we deal with. And, the hydrants were never designed for conflagration. Were never designed that way. And then you add that you move hundreds of fire engines into the area, and people are all trying to get water out of there. And God love you if you still have power. And even if you've got a tower or cistern out there, you're going to drain them pretty quickly. As the houses are burning, they're the line going into the house is now just free flowing. It doesn't take much to drain anything. But I always maintain your people from Public Works, Road Department. They've got great equipment. If you can't get a hold of somebody in the private side that can come in and do some things, just imperative. And I mean, probably you don't know this one, but I actually did an after action with another compadre of mine, Bob Roper from Western Fire Chiefs. We did the after action for Maui Fire Department on Lahaina, and things we know, we share with them. But we did an operational review for them, and had a little over 100 recommendations that we put into place for them that they've really gone to town over. And I think there's so much to be learned. If there's no perfect incident that I've ever been on in my career, but the bigger, the more complicated, even more finger pointing, but the ability to get things done and how you get them done and working through that, because either you're going to be crowned as by the community for doing a great job, or you're going to be crucified. And so it's always better to work and to make adjustments on the fly. I always tell people, I said, there've been a few times in my career that that early on as an early company officer, I may have made a tactical mistake going in and only to have the BC come in and have to correct it for me, but vice versa was, being a young chief officer and having to come in and maybe order up another alarm, to make up so we don't have waste time trying to pick up and move everything again. And a lot to be learned during the time. And what's smart is that the more we can, sit down on those after actions and pass those things along. So it's a learning time for somebody else who's up and coming, or, you think back through when you go back and do these things, really makes a big difference in my book.
If somebody's listening, what's the biggest thing you would try to transfer to them about, that you learned from this incident that you'd want people to continue forward? I mean, you mentioned, paying attention to the relationships, having conversations with just about anybody and everybody you can to learn as much as you can. I get, what would be the cherry on top that you would want, generations to transfer on from this incident?
So one of the things I would tell anybody right away is that, when you provide mutual aid, you go to help your neighbor, try to be a good guest, and, try not to tell, if you're Oklahoma and you've got the LA cities, New York cities, Phoenix is coming in the world, you don't need somebody to tell you how to do your job. You just need somebody to work with you. And I used to tell folks that, oh my God, I said, look, I tell you what, keep your mouth shut, listen, learn, as long as it's not unsafe, just make it happen. When you host a big event, we'll critique you then. That, and I mean that you've really got to be very humble in working with folks in today's day and age. Real quickly, you can outstay your welcome before you even know it. And again, like I said, you really got to stay tied. Make sure when you're working with another agency, you've got good agency rep or good liaison there that you can tie into. Have open and honest discussions. I think those are really important to me. We've come a very long ways in our mental health side from where I was in my early days. Even in the USAR program, it's become a very big issue, no different than anywhere else. I've been very lucky. When I was at Cal OES, I was very, very supportive of behavioral health issues. We signed on with California Professional Firefighters to support that project, and still do it to this day. Still a committee. We actually type our dogs and our clinicians and all those folks, so when we need to actually move them during emergencies, we can actually make all that come together. So I think that's good. I think never stop learning. Never stop learning. There's always a better way, or a new tool or something that's out there. I think, when we were talking about technology early on, and one of the things I would also tell you is that we didn't have tablet command back then. Well, I look at what tablet command and some of these other products that people have got out there, and we've really come a long ways. And technology is there to help us do our job, not do it for us. At Western, we're working right now with NASA on how we make decisions in wildland and stuff. And we got some people that are very worried, and well, I don't want that, I want IA to question me. And I said, won't be there to question you, be there to, help you, but at the end of the day, I said, I don't want it either, because, but I do want, IA, if we get to that point, to help us, put a couple things on that checklist we may not have, or somebody else has got, that we can think about. And I think that's the important part. Just like new tools are always coming out for the rescue side of the house. And, if you're a truckie or a rescuee, or, the engine folks, I used to laugh because, engine get called out and the truckies would roll over and go back to sleep. So
still happens to this day, but, not as often, but right. Like,
but we tease each other, and as much as we tease each other, it's a good form of flattery. And no one, service is delivered every day in the back of our apparatus. If you're lucky enough to have an engine, God love you. If you're lucky enough to have a truck, and that truck has specialized equipment, God love you. If you're lucky enough and you got a rescue, or you've got a tender or a foam unit, or I don't care what you got, those are all expertise. And departments develop them because they've had past issues. They want to have a better way of doing them. It takes an entire team to work together. No, you're only as strong as that weakest link, as I strongly believe. And that's, for us in public safety, we answer to, me answer to the fire chief, who answers to the city council, the county board of supervisors, to the fire district. We answer to somebody, but ultimately we answer to the public. And I'd like to make sure that we continue to adjust and reevaluate and make sure that, we're better than the next group. That, learn from the people who came before us. And then when they show up and they'll shake their heads how we're doing it, we'll tell them why we're doing it. To me, the fire department doesn't exist to provide us a job. We exist to provide service to the public that we whether it's our city or county or fire district or volunteer organization. And tell me who doesn't, that's really why we exist, to provide that level of service to, as Alan Bertocini said, Mr. and Mrs.
That's
Smith,
right.
They're the client out there. And the days when we get to go, provide mutual aid to somebody, that's also a good day. No, who doesn't, well, we get enough fire. Well, should I go to another big roar, or, the USAR community and one side, they want to go out and be utilized. Most of us hope that you don't want to host an event.
Yeah.
And that's where I always come from, is that a good day is a slow day, and a day that you don't lose anybody, and a day that we don't have any of our people injured. So,
Yeah. Well, Chief, these are some really great takeaways and key points here that you've gone through. One thing I do want to circle back to is you had mentioned the debrief, and what was that like at the time?
I didn't want to do it. I was ordered to do it, and I actually had to go see, a professional, and ends up being very uncomfortable. Back then, we didn't speak as often as we do today. Releasing our feelings and those things, but I look back and it actually helped me as I advanced in my career to supporting were some of the things we do today. We were talking earlier, it's a kinder, gentler fire service than we have been. And I think that's really good in a lot of ways. And I think that we continue to learn, and we will continue to have to do a better job of taking care of our own, whether it's related to on the job or stuff that happens in our lives that we bring to the job and how that impacts us all. But I think that it's so much more different today than it was back then. And, it's almost like I look back and I think, oh, it's almost like caveman days. And, but we've really come a very, very long ways.
Yeah.
And looking after our people and doing the follow-up. I mentioned Maui, and one of the things we chatted with Chief Ventura when we were there and his staff was probably the need for the next 25 years to follow up from their oldest to the youngest firefighters to how they're dealing with it, because they're really unique, and some communities are unique when they're just small. But imagine you're on an island and
everybody.
You can't keep calling for help the way we do, but a lot of the people on that island are all families, like a small community is. And I think when you work for a large organization, and we surely see it today, a lot of our people like to get out of the urban area and into the more rural areas and commute in and do those things. So I think, again, you always have to take a pulse on your organization, and trust me, each one of them are unique. And I hear that all the time. Well, you don't understand. We're very special. We're all very special, but you really have to take a good look at your organization, what makes it tick. What's also really good is also look how your organization evolved. I feel very strongly in making sure that if you've got, somebody's been around your organization for a very long time, they're good historians. Those are really the people that glam on to look at how we're evolving, how we're doing. I always tell fire chiefs to come in from the outside. And I said, man, before you come in and start telling them how you did them from where you're from, I said, try to put that beside. I said, try to come in and really learn, about the people, about the organization, how they've got from point A to point B, and how you're going to get to point C around the corner. But very good people will make sure they've got good relationships at all ends of the organization, and as well as making sure they've got relationships with the people they work for or that run their organization, from city managers or county execs or wherever. You really takes time, takes effort. Nothing happens overnight. And I can tell you, after 18 years as fire chief, when I first took over, well, I had some great ideas. And as I got closer and closer to my end time, I said, wow, how could the time have gone so quick? And I still haven't gotten some of these things checked off my list.
Well, they evolved, right? Like we evolved, ideas evolved as people get. And speaking of that, Chief, I mean, you've bestowed so much, obviously, recapping and recanting the Oklahoma City bombing. And again, thank you for enlightening us on just how massive of a undertaking that was. And for those that weren't alive during that time, I highly recommend to go back and do some research on it. For those that were, same thing, just to kind of rekindle your historical side and read about that incident, and obviously then take into heart what Chief had gone through with the thousands of others that really made that recovery effort possible. You talked about relationships, you talked about being curious and not judgmental. And it all comes back to, constantly learning. And that's really the emphasis of the program and the podcast, and to which you've actually really summed up. But I always try to end with one final question. And, you've been in the fire service for 48 years, and you're still trying to evolve. You're still trying to learn. So, I mean, what's your main focus on in this day and age? How are you trying to get better?
I honestly believe I'd like to leave the fire service better than when I found it. And I love the job. The job has been me, and it's hard to turn off. I care about the people each and every day that show up for work or that answer the calls. I sometimes miss the old days, when we'd have a working fire and they'd hit the old plectrons and get the off-duty people back in, but again, I think we're evolving for a lot of good things. But that's why I just like to see things better than what we had, and I like our personnel to have more capability. I honestly believe that technology is there. How we pay for it is going to be our bigger issue. But if we can monitor our troops on the ground and know that hey, this heart rate's way up there, it's not coming down. We need to get them out of there. I mean, those are the types of things I think we could go a lot further in saving some of our people, or them having longer lives and doing things. If the poor chief officers today are going to definitely need a technician to be there next to them, monitoring all the things that they're going to have to keep an eye on, and we're going to have to continue to evolve on how we use technology to make things safer and more efficient.
Yeah. And so it's just, as it goes back to what you're saying, just continually trying to learn and embrace this new technology, but also understand where everything came from, right? But Chief, thank you so much for joining us. All great stuff. Just recapping some of the great things that Chief Z bestowed on us. We have to remember our history to learn from it. So please take a look back at the Oklahoma City bombing. It was a dark day for the U.S. and for our country, and for those family members. But from that, we've grown. As Chief has mentioned, there's a lot of lessons that we learned from that incident that have transferred to even today's response, and we must keep that alive. So please go back, review that incident, and also, one of the things you talked about, Chief, was building those relationships at every corner, at every aspect of the city, whether it's with the politicians, public service, or public works. And so we encourage people to continually do that, have conversations with those, that you come in contact with every day, because they can help you do your job better and maybe a resource for you. And I love this one, is that you're always trying to learn, and especially for, people, when you're going into their territory or you're going into their call, make sure you're asking questions and not trying to take over. And I wrote down, be curious, not judgmental. And I think a lot of us can really grow from that statement. And it all brings it back to why you're listening. It's about getting better. And again, thank you, Chief, for being here. And ultimately, all that knowledge you bestowed on us is, in essence, the reason why we're going to get better. We're going to continually to learn. We're going to continually do something, share something, which will ultimately make ourselves and those around us better every shift. Thanks for listening.